Okay, perfect. No, keep it on. Yeah, it's streaming now. Yeah, I can hear you. So it's streaming now. I'm gonna be quiet.
Everyone is different. The two apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone, without exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
Hello and welcome. There are currently over 380 viewers on the platform and countless others watching this launch on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. We have people attending from over 105 countries, and if you're here on the platform, please share the city and the country where you're joining in the chat. Today's event is available to view in English, Spanish, and French, as well as American Sign Language. If you want to change the language settings, please select Watch Live Event in your preferred language from the navigation menu at the top of your screen. Live captioning is also available for today's event, so if you're on Facebook, click the settings wheel to enable live caption. The report is available in Braille, an easy-to-read summary, which means it can be read by those with visual impairments. And the summary report is available online today in 12 languages, with over 12 additional languages coming under production. An accessible online version of the full report will be available within the month. We want you to have as much interaction here today with us as possible throughout the whole event and invite you to pose questions on Twitter or in the chat function using the hashtag #AllMeansAll. That's hashtag #AllMeansAll. Be sure to include your Twitter handle. The Global Education Monitoring Report team will respond to all of your questions after the event if we don't get round to them today. During the next hour, we're going to be hearing from inclusion champions, ministers, teachers, and leaders from different corners of the world, whose stories and efforts go to the very heart of the theme of the 2020 GEM report, inclusion. This report calls on all educators to widen their understanding of inclusive education to include all learners, no matter their identity, background, or ability. To believe that every person is unique, has potential, and should be respected, and that rather seeing it as a problem, put diversity at the core of education systems. Now it's time to hear from our first speaker, UNESCO's Director General, Audrey Azoulay.
I am delighted to welcome you to the launch of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education. Today's launch is taking place online, a first in the history of the report due to COVID-19. As Souleymane Bachir Diagne, the Senegalese philosopher, put it, the cold and forgiving light of this pandemic has revealed many of the inequalities affecting today's world. And I would argue that this is especially true in the field of education. In April, at the peak of the pandemic, school closures affected 1.5 billion young people in 194 countries. School closures have also deprived the most underprivileged learners of affordable food, protection, and social support, which could lead to increased dropout rates, especially among girls. However, as this report reminds us, these inequalities already existed before the crisis. In at least 20 countries, hardly any poor rural young women complete secondary school at all. Learners at risk of exclusion, particularly those living with disabilities, also suffer from a lack of inclusion in education. Today's crisis is an opportunity in this sense, an opportunity to learn lessons and build more resilient and effective education systems for tomorrow. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report seeks to identify all causes of exclusion, to produce a more complete definition of inclusion, and also underlines the need for more and better data, especially on vulnerable learners. It encourages us to build more human and inclusive schools, schools where each and every student feels they belong, schools free from prejudice and discrimination, and centered around the well-being of learners. The report's 10 messages are precisely this call to action. They are a path forward, and UNESCO is determined to support its member states in this respect. Today, we have an opportunity to make education more inclusive, a cornerstone for a more resilient society. As the Global Education Monitoring Report underlines, education is for everyone, not just a few. All means all. I thank you. I am delighted to welcome you to the launch of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education. Today's launch is taking place online, a first in the history of the report due to COVID-19. As Souleymane Bachir Diagne, the Senegalese philosopher, put it,
So we've just heard a call to action from UNESCO's Director General in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Next, let's hear more about the timeliness of today's report with a discussion between the GEM Report's Advisory Board Chair and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, and Director Manos Antonis. Helen and Manos will examine how this new report is so relevant to what is going on around the world today and why it's essential reading for education policymakers as they rebuild education systems in the wake of the pandemic.
The COVID-19 pandemic has brought about the biggest challenge to the education sector that any of us have ever seen. A high proportion of the world's children haven't been able to attend school during lockdowns in their countries, and many may never return to school. Many may enter child labour as their families face deeper impoverishment. So the pandemic has made worse exclusion for those who were already at risk of disengaging from or dropping out of education. Evidence available in the new Global Education Monitoring Report being released today suggests that 40% of the world's poorest countries were not able to target marginalized children during the crisis. Thus, the messages and the recommendations that you will hear about today about inclusion and education couldn't come at a more important time. Manos Antonis, I think you will agree that the pandemic has exposed many fault lines in education and societies. So can you tell us a little more, informed by the new report, about the opportunities and also about the obligation that there is to rethink our education systems post-pandemic?
Thank you, Helen. Without a doubt, COVID-19 has just added a new layer of complexity to the challenge of inclusion in education. At its peak in April, 91% of the global student population was affected in 194 countries. And even today, as we speak, 2 in 3 are still out of school. The world was caught by surprise by the magnitude of the challenge, and it is no wonder that no perfect response has been found. But as you said, school closures have disproportionately affected the marginalized. Most support mechanisms for disadvantaged students, be it school meals or services for disabled students, were interrupted as well. Solutions to learning continuity through online learning opportunities have captured the headlines, and they have been truly inspiring, opening a window to the future. For some, it is a euphoric prospect. For others, it's a dystopic one. But what we know for sure is that they offer only a partial substitute for the education experience. And the reality is that disadvantaged students were more likely not to benefit even from these opportunities that were on offer, because they lacked the right device, because their internet connection was not really available, was not cheap, because they didn't have a proper home environment to work in. Many websites and programs are simply not accessible for blind or deaf students, or they may not be available at an appropriate language, even if the technology allows that. And let's not forget, this is only a small part of the challenge. If we think in truly global terms, even such opportunities have been an exception. Only 12% of households in least developed countries have internet access at home. Even low-tech solutions are not working. Just think of Ethiopia, where the 20% of the poorest households have only 7% of them have access to the radio. None have access to a television. So for those students, which count in the hundreds of millions, learning has practically stopped. And what worries us all, as you said, is whether these poorest may not even go back to school when schools reopen, because their family has been plunged more deeply into poverty. For many, those who, as you said, suffer stereotypes and discrimination at school, the question even arises whether it is the place they actually want to go back to. It is this that makes the placement of inclusion at the center of recovery plans in education even more critical. You're right to say that we have an opportunity and an obligation to build back better.
Indeed, we do. And it seems to me that we certainly should draw inspiration for reimagining the education system from the extraordinary dedication and professionalism of our teachers around the world. During the time of the pandemic lockdowns, we've seen them adapting their ways of working to meet the needs of their students. So Manos, how can we make sure that their innovations and experiences can be built on and not forgotten as the pandemic recedes?
I completely agree that millions of teachers have thrown themselves selflessly and gone to great depths and great lengths to keep learning going. Let us not forget, in most cases, without even any preparation. These past months, we have been reminded yet again of the vital role that teachers can play in fostering inclusion, not only inside, but also outside classrooms, when they follow up with their students, ensuring no one is left behind or uncared of.
Thank you, Manos. We live in a world which is ever more complex and ever more volatile. And there's no doubt that we have to think differently about the future of education. So during today's event, we're going to hear a lot more about what the concrete steps are that we could take to make our education systems much more inclusive of every student everywhere.
We've just heard from Helen and Manos how society has been fundamentally changed by the global pandemic. Education systems will have to change too. Let's now hear more from Manos and some personalities you may well recognize on why we should use this situation we are faced in now to eliminate existing barriers and the wide range of issues related to inclusion, which threaten the world's chances of achieving the 2030 targets.
It has been and continues to be a challenging time for all, for some much more than others. Even for those with the relative luxury to connect online, the demands on your time have been tough in recent months, which is why we are so grateful to all of you who joined today. Your presence shows your commitment to the case for inclusion, a commitment that all countries made when they signed up for SDG 4 to be achieved by 2030. A commitment that we cannot afford to lose sight of, despite the current difficulties. If anything, as our discussion just showed, the case has only become stronger. But what do we mean by inclusion? The report has defined inclusion in education, first and foremost, as a process contributing to the overall goal of social inclusion. It consists of actions that embrace diversity and build a sense of belonging. These actions should be rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential. Every person should be respected, regardless of their background, ability, or identity, as each and every one of us comes with our differences. It is about not discriminating against anyone. It is about not rejecting anyone. It is about adapting to learners, making all accommodations possible to cater for their diverse needs. It is not about learners adapting to the system. It is not about setting up an inclusive education department in a ministry and considering the work done. The case for inclusion has been championed powerfully by those supporting the rights of people with disabilities. It is thanks to their efforts that the right to inclusive education is guaranteed in international law. But inclusion should not be associated with one group. The mindsets and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. Every society needs to own up to their mechanisms that exclude. Inclusion in education is a key step for building inclusive, tolerant societies where differences of opinion can be freely expressed and where different voices can be heard to achieve social cohesion. Yet identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunities. There are two parts to this. First, it is about those left out. Shocking though it might be, a discussion of inclusion has to start from the about 258 million children, adolescents, and youth out of school. In 12 countries, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely never to go to school than their peers without disabilities. The world set a target for all to complete secondary school by 2030, but we found at least 20 countries where not a single poor rural woman completes secondary school. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. This brings me to the second point, which is about what happens in the classrooms. Among those who do complete lower secondary school, students from the richest households are 2 times more likely to learn basic skills than the poorest. Achieving learning gains, for instance, halving learning poverty as the World Bank has proposed, let alone eliminating it by 2030, which is what the international community signed up to, will not be achieved only with technical interventions on how to read. It requires thinking about the experience of the student. Their well-being matters. Stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination mean millions are alienated inside classrooms. That means also that they're less likely to progress through education. Grade 4 students in middle and high-income countries who are not learning in their home language are 34% less likely to learn basic reading skills. Just 41 countries worldwide recognize sign language as an official language. LGBTI students in the United States are 3 times more likely to stay home from school because of feeling unsafe.
We've just heard from Manos that all children have the right to go to school and learn, regardless of who they are, where they are, or how much money their family has. Let's next hear from Brina, one of the GEM Report's inclusion champions, on how she is leading the charge to ensure the right to education for children just like her.
Hello, everyone. I am Pina Maxino from the Philippines. I'm a person with intellectual disability because I have Down syndrome. Down syndrome is one of the most common genetic birth defects and causes physical and intellectual developmental delays and disabilities. When I was 9 years old, a doctor told my parents that I might not live long because I had hole in my heart and very poor muscle tone. With the love and support of my family, I am now 23 years old. When I was 10 years old, a psychologist said that I had borderline intellectual functioning and that I might not even finish grade school. But I exceeded her expectations. At 16 years old, I graduated from a regular high school as class valedictorian. At 20 years old, I graduated from university with a Bachelor of Arts degree, major in history. I also earned 2 other diplomas while in college for general clerical skills and for associate in arts. I am very happy to have graduated from university, not with 1 or 2, but with 3 diploma courses. Today, I work as a preschool assistant teacher, and every day I go to work and help 80 children learn the skills that will help them succeed in life, whatever their dreams. I will say that for students with disabilities, overcoming lower expectations can be half the battle. I studied in regular schools because I was slower than the regular kids. I had to work harder. It's sad that some people do not see our hard work. Instead, they only see our disabilities. There were schools that did not accept me because of my disability. School leaders and teachers sometimes do not believe that disabled students belong in classrooms with other children. Every day, people with intellectual disabilities are excluded from education because some people think that we are not good enough or cannot achieve as much as our peers. They are wrong. There are so many bright and talented disabled children who could shine in mainstream schools with the right support. Yet, education systems in some countries are moving against inclusion. Laws in a quarter of countries say that children with disabilities should be educated in separate settings. I am what I am today because of strong support system. First, because of my parents and my family who loves me unconditionally. Second, because of teachers and tutors who provided support and learning materials to fit my needs. Third, because of the inclusive schools that accepted me and encouraged me to do my best. My story is proof that inclusion in education brings out the best in us all. Thank you.
We just heard from Brina how education systems aren't working for everyone. Barriers to inclusion exist everywhere. They reside in minds,
Hello
traditions,
everyone.
buildings, and systems.
I am Rina
The
Maxino from
COVID-19
the
pandemic
Philippines.
has cast a light on
I am a person
inequality
with
from
intellectual
330
disability because I have Down
children who
syndrome.
depend on formula.
Down
A digital
syndrome
divide in
is
which
one
children
of the
without
most
devices or
common
reliable internet
genetic birth
cannot
defects
be
and
learning
causes
differently.
physical and
Access to effective
intellectual
learning is
developmental
for Indigenous
delays and
students, a
disabilities.
community of learners who even
When I
before
was
the
9 years
pandemic
old,
faced
a
major
doctor told my
medical
parents
challenges.
that I might not live
Let's find
long
out more
because I had
about
hole
the
in my
importance
heart
of the
and
report.
very poor
Of the
muscle
report's
tone.
hashtag all
With the
means
love and
all
support
message for
of my
Indigenous
family,
people.
I am now 23 years old. When I was 10 years old, a psychologist said that I had borderline intellectual functioning and that I might not even finish grade school. but I exceeded her expectations. At 16 years old, as class valedictorian. At 20 years old, I graduated from university.
Las comunidades indígenas hablan la gran mayoría de los 7.000 idiomas de nuestro mundo. Aportamos una cultura rica y una historia profunda a cualquier ambiente de aprendizaje. Sin embargo, contra la discriminación para sentirnos bienvenidos en la educación. Como embajadora de buena voluntad para la UNESCO, estoy prestando mi voz a su nuevo informe GEN 2020, que exige que los sistemas de educación abracen mejor a los estudiantes indígenas. Muchos países están buscando la forma de asegurarse de que las políticas educativas reflejen y respeten nuestros orígenes. Pero los niños que no se ven beneficiados de esto están cansados de esperar. No podemos dejar pasar su única oportunidad de educación. Les pido a los países que analicen determinadamente sus políticas educativas y se aseguren de que reflejan la diversidad de nuestra sociedad multicultural. Deben comenzar su evaluación sobre la base de que todos los alumnos deben de ser tratados como iguales en el aula. Es lógico que un niño tendrá dificultades para aprender si los libros de texto que se le están proporcionando están en un idioma que no entienden. Los maestros deben de recibir capacitaciones e ideas para asegurarse de que celebrarán la diversidad de los estudiantes que van a encontrar en el aula. Sin estos cambios, los estudiantes de las poblaciones indígenas reciben el mensaje por parte de su sistema educativo de que no pertenecen a él y su aprendizaje inevitablemente se ve perjudicado. No es casualidad que los estudiantes de 8 años en América Latina que no hablan el idioma del examen sean 3 veces menos propensos a comprender y leer lo que se les está presentando. Todos los niños merecen un futuro decente e inclusivo.
Now, let's hear once again from Director Manos which policies we should be prioritizing as we rebuild education after.
There's one key overarching recommendation for all those involved in education. We need to see learner diversity not as a problem, but as an opportunity. Inclusion cannot be achieved if it is seen as an harbor the belief that children's ability and capacity to learn is fixed. The report calls on all countries to widen the understanding of inclusive education to encompass all learners, regardless of identity, background, or ability. Inclusion is not just for a few. When we say education for all, we do really mean all. This report is for everyone and refers to all countries: the albinos in sub-Saharan Africa, the stateless in Arab countries, the Roma in Europe, the displaced Rohingya in Asia, the Afro-descendants in Latin America. Hence the hashtag all means all that you can use to tweet about the 2020 GEM report. Yet many governments do not base their laws and policies on this principle. The report found that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but only 57% of definitions cover multiple marginalized groups. In a quarter of countries, the definition of inclusive education only covers people with disabilities or special needs. This is a general recommendation that our partners that you see on this slide have actually been endorsing. But interventions should also be coherent from early childhood to adulthood. A review of 32 early childhood education programs in Europe identified active participation as key to ensure that children learn and develop a sense of belonging. In India, children who are forced to repeat a primary grade are less likely to complete primary school. Yet a dozen states have abandoned the no repetition policy in recent years. In tertiary education, only 11% of 71 countries had comprehensive equity strategies. Barriers to inclusion are not only treated and related to laws and policies, they are also related to financing. That does not mean inclusion is costly by definition. If planned in advance, inclusion is much cheaper than if changes are made later as an afterthought. Moreover, simple gestures and ways to manage a classroom cost nothing, and yet are the most valuable contributions to inclusion. Still, efforts need to be made to ensure we get equity and inclusion right through our funding approaches. There are two parts to this story. First, how governments allocate funding in general and whether or not they compensate for disadvantage when they allocate resources to local authorities or schools matters. Allocating the same to everyone may be politically simpler, but is not good for equity. Second, how governments target education resources to those students and those families most in need also matters. Both general and targeted resources are needed, not only in cash, but also in kind. For example, 1 in 4 countries have quotas for access to tertiary education for disadvantaged groups. And not only through education, but also through other social policies budgets. For example, social protection programs in Latin America have increased education attainment by up to 1.5 years. There is no ideal funding mechanism. Countries vary in history, understanding of inclusive education, and levels of decentralization. Some countries are moving away from assigning funding to each and separate type of need, which may inflate the number of students identified with these needs, to simple funding for schools that takes all possible needs into account. There is one other dimension to financing inclusive education. The overall objective is to ensure all children attend their local mainstream school and receive the support they need. Many countries are still far from this objective. Analysis in this report of laws worldwide shows that 25% of countries still call for students with disabilities to be educated in separate settings. Another 48% call for at least partial segregation. The 2020 GEM report is frank about the numerous challenges to achieve inclusion. Moving from where we are now to having systems that cater for every learner's needs, including those with severe disabilities, is no small feat. In many ways, it is a planning and management challenge. A legacy of segregation means that human and material resources to support diversity have been concentrated in a few places and are unequally distributed. Mechanisms and incentives are needed to share specialist resources and ensure that such expertise support all mainstream schools. In several countries, resource centers, itinerant teachers, or networks of educators are used to support the transition to inclusion. Let's look at these recommendations now from a country perspective.
Hi. See, Education 2030 framework for action has a minimum of about 15% of total public expenditure. And Sierra Leone allocated the highest share of 32.5% for the global public expenditure benchmark, as seen in the report. In 2018, we doubled down on our commitment when His Excellency President Bill launched the Free Quality School Education Program, which expanded access to pre-primary and senior secondary school. As a basic right, we must hold ourselves accountable to guaranteeing. The enrollment numbers have been staggering. Just last year, we added nearly 700,000 new learners. We have achieved gender parity in primary and junior secondary school level, and there remains, even though there still remains a big gap in senior secondary. We won't stop until we have true equity, not just from pre-primary, but right through educational system. This is why we in Sierra Leone, the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, which I lead, has one of its principles that we call radical inclusion. Radical inclusion means to us that we seek to ensure that children with all abilities and disabilities, including physical and cognitive and psychosocial, can all access and receive quality education so that they too can contribute to national development. Radical inclusion means that children and their support systems at home and in the community receive all the well-being, psychosocial and mental health support to best prepare them to take advantage of learning in schools and at home. Radical inclusion means the supports to access school and learning, no matter their situation. You see, we seek to do this by optimizing for the enhanced learning of all children, and that means their physical, cognitive, psychosocial, and social economic differences are not impediments to their access to learning. And we do this by also removing all infrastructural, systemic, and policy roadblocks that limit learning for any child. It's not just theory. Over the last 6 months since I became minister, and certainly in the last 2 years since the new government, we have overturned the ban on pregnant girls, which prevented girls who got pregnant from attending school and taking exams. When schools reopen, we will start a stay in school incentive for girls, because we know that transition rates and transition levels are not the same as for boys. During this COVID school closures, we have had a zero schoolgirls pregnancy campaign, because we understood that during Ebola, society failed young girls when about 10,000 of them got pregnant and were prevented from going to school. So it's the responsibility of all stakeholders in community and society to ensure that girls are protected. As we now think about reopening schools for COVID, because of the COVID school closures, we saw that the rural poor, those with disabilities, girls have suffered the most. And that is why we are working with all stakeholders to ensure that as schools reopen for examination classes, that those schools are given all the necessary equipment to think about wash facilities, to think about meals that kids can take home, such that we support them in school and at home. For us, radical inclusion is equivalent to all means all, and we won't stop until all children have equal opportunities to access quality education, so that they too can fulfill their human potential, no matter where they are, no matter what they look like, and no matter the agenda. That is why, as a ministry, we have prioritized radical inclusion. That is why, as a government, we have championed free quality school education. And that is why we won't stop until all means all. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks, Minister Senga. It's great to be here at today's launch. The UK is delighted to be a long-standing supporter of GEM, and the annual report is rightly globally recognised and respected. And it's really important for development partners like the UK, because it provides up-to-date data and evidence so that we can measure progress and be transparent and accountable in our shared efforts to deliver SDG 4. And the message of this year's report, All Mean All, reminds us that despite so much progress in the last 2 decades in getting children into school, we're a long way from achieving equality and equity and leaving no one behind. And the report reminds us that exclusion can be driven by any number of factors, and multiple exclusions reinforce each other. And this message is even more important in the context of COVID-19. The pandemic has brought children's education to a temporary standstill. We've lost millions of hours in learning, and it's placing huge pressures on education budgets at national, international, and household levels. And we just heard there from Minister Senga about some of the other challenges it's facing, it's bringing to girls. The UK has long supported education for some of the world's poorest and most marginalised children, and we stand up for the right of every girl in the world to have 12 years of quality education. In the last 4 months, we've adapted our bilateral programmes and our flagship Girls Education Challenge to keep education going, to keep people safe, by supporting distance learning for both teachers and pupils. And we're the largest donor to the Global Fund for Education in Emergencies, Education Cannot Wait, and a leading donor to the Global Partnership for Education. In the longer term, alongside investments to improve the overall quality of education, we're supporting countries to build more inclusive education systems, getting hard to reach girls into school and learning, including girls with disabilities and those affected by crises, but also poor rural girls, pregnant girls, and those vulnerable to early marriage. One of our priorities in the coming year must be to ensure there's a global push to get all girls, including the most marginalised, back to school when countries judge it safe to do so. UNICEF will be leading its largest ever back to school campaign, Opening Up Better, and DFID will get behind this by joining up with UNICEF and education ministries at country level, and by focusing internationally on the importance of education to a sustainable COVID recovery. And so I encourage all of you here today to get behind this vital initiative and come together to build back education systems that are better, systems that take inclusion seriously and that prioritise inclusive learning for all children. And by signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals, we committed to leave no one behind. And now we must come together to make that a reality.
So inclusion isn't just a question of funding and political will. It's about challenging people to think differently and welcome those marginalised into classrooms. It's something all of the participants logged on today can help with. All of us can achieve this together. So let's hear more from the GEM report about the key role that school communities and non-governmental organisations play in developing education systems where everybody is enabled to reach their highest potential.
As I said earlier, a key barrier to inclusion in education is the lack of belief that it is possible and desirable. This lack of belief is not only a challenge for policymakers or teachers. Parents and communities may hold discriminatory beliefs too. Some 15% of parents in Germany and 59% in Hong Kong fear that children with disabilities disrupted others' learning. Many parents prefer the feeling of familiarity or exclusivity that some schools offer. School choice often exacerbates a tendency to self-segregate. The report refers to several examples, for instance, in Chile by income, in Denmark between natives and migrants, in Lebanon along sectarian lines, or in Malaysia by ethnicity. The report also shows that over a third of Black students in the United States are in schools where at least 9 out of 10 of their classmates are also Black. But it is not only a preference for being apart that can lead to separation. Parents of vulnerable children may also have genuine fears that their children are not served well in mainstream schools. A study in Queensland, Australia, showed that 37% of students with intellectual disabilities in special schools had previously been in mainstream schools, where conditions were not sufficiently supportive. Schools and governments should invite parents and communities to voice their concerns and treat them as equals in the design of policies and programs on inclusion in education. In many ways, partnership is a key word for government efforts to achieve inclusion. First, education ministries must work with other ministries to jointly identify and exchange information on the needs of disadvantaged children and their families as early as possible. This is the basis for integrating services based on shared data and standards. Such integration improves the quality and effectiveness of services. In Colombia, 3 registries communicate with each other to identify populations who are extremely poor, internally displaced, and indigenous. A multidimensional index estimates living standards to identify those most in need who should benefit from social programs. Worldwide, unfortunately, in practice, deep-rooted norms, traditions, and bureaucratic working cultures tend to keep service delivery in silos, preventing coordination. In Jordan, the 2 main government bodies responsible for people with disabilities had different ways of accrediting special education centers, undermining efforts to promote inclusion. A new 10-year strategy will address this issue. Second, education ministries need to ensure that when local governments have a mandate to provide services for inclusion, that they are fully funded and the capacities of the local officials are developed. Often, this is not the case. Many countries decentralize responsibility to local governments, but do not pay sufficient attention to the ability of these authorities to deliver, with the result that inequality is exacerbated. Organizations for people with disabilities, disabled people's organizations, grassroots associations, and international NGOs active in development and education play key roles in making the case for inclusion in societies. They play 2 distinct but often overlapping roles. First, these organizations are advocates and watchdogs for the right to inclusive education. They monitor progress on government commitments, often providing valuable information to regional and international bodies. They defend against rights violations. They campaign for inclusive policies. In Armenia, an NGO campaign resulted in a government decision to roll out inclusive education nationally by 2025. Governments should create conditions enabling NGOs to monitor fulfillment of government commitments and stand up for those excluded from education. Second, these organizations provide education services, whether on government contract or on their own initiative. They support groups that governments often do not reach, such as street children, or they offer alternative, sometimes non-formal and second chance programs. The government of Afghanistan supports community-based education, which has been critical for reaching girls in rural areas. Governments must collaborate with NGOs to ensure that the provision of education leads to inclusion, meets standards, is aligned with national policy, does not duplicate services, and does not lead to competition for limited funds. China aims to put in place an effective system to purchase services from NGOs and pass relevant legislation by the end of this year.
The challenge of supporting inclusion in education cannot be met by governments alone. We all have a responsibility to ensure that schools and classrooms reflect the diversity of the societies in which we live. Individuals and organizations worldwide are working with communities and governments to design and implement inclusive education programs. Building school communities that are inclusive, welcoming, and supportive of all children, and creating the spaces for people to see inclusion in practice.
Every person is unique, and schools must reflect that diversity and support the many differences every child and student contributes. For this reason, our education policies must be guided by a human rights approach that strives to reduce gaps in our society. The papilloma vaccination in every school, the local committees for Indigenous education, or the guideline to eradicate ethnic racial discrimination in education centers are some examples of efforts made by my country, Costa Rica, on this route. In May 2020, my country was the first in Central America to legalize same-sex marriage. This represents just another example of our commitment to build a society where all people have the same rights as any other person. I joined the GEM report in asking countries to take a hard look at their education policies and to ensure they reflect the invaluable diversity within society. Government often talk about leaving no one behind, and that has to include students of all backgrounds, abilities, and identities. We cannot achieve inclusion one group at a time. After all, as this GEM report states, all means all. And we, in Costa Rica, mean it.
Barriers to quality education are still too high for far too many learners. 1 in 5 children, adolescents, and youths are entirely excluded from education. Stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination means millions more are further alienated inside classrooms. The GEM report's next 3 recommendations highlight why we need to strive to make all places of learning accessible to all, empower teachers to teach in diverse classrooms, and collect the right data to ensure that resources reach those the most at risk of falling behind.
The simple but powerful concept of universal design refers to products, environments, programs, and services made to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. In education, the concept is mainly associated with the design of school buildings to make them accessible for learners with disabilities. It has since been extended to describe approaches that minimize barriers to learning for those with disabilities through flexible learning environments. But this underlying idea of flexibility to overcome barriers in the interaction of learners with the education system is applicable on a wider scale. All students should learn from the same flexible, relevant, and accessible curricula that recognize diversity and respond to various learners' needs. Yet many countries do not adapt curricula to students' needs. They modify them to exclude or separate, for instance, teaching students with disabilities a special curriculum. pushing lower achievers into slower education tracks, offering refugees only the curriculum of their home country, as among Burundian and Congolese refugees in Tanzania. Textbooks can exclude by perpetuating stereotypes through omission and misrepresentation. Only 24% of text and images in secondary school textbooks were of women in the Punjab province of Pakistan. A review of 49 European countries found that only 23 address sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression explicitly. These are not easy issues for any country. There are political challenges regarding the kind of society people aspire to achieve through education. Inclusion is an exercise in democracy. There are also technical challenges in offering relevant knowledge in ways that do not cut off some learners. Finally, assessment should be aligned with curricula and textbooks, be formative, and allow students to demonstrate learning in a variety of ways. If too narrow, assessment can be the deciding factor between who gets to stay in school and who will drop out, when it should be there as a way to improve students' learning. Teachers need training on inclusion. Around a quarter of teachers in middle and high-income countries reported a high need for professional development on teaching students with special needs. But teachers should not be taught inclusive approaches as a specialist topic, rather as a core element of their ongoing education. In New Brunswick, Canada, for instance, a quarter of all teachers were trained to support students with autism spectrum disorders. Teachers are not immune to social biases. Their ongoing education needs to tackle entrenched views of some students as being deficient and unable to learn. In the United States, 31% of teachers believed inequality was mainly due to African Americans lacking the willpower to pull themselves out of poverty. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, grade 8 mathematics teachers were more likely to give white students a passing grade than their equally proficient and well-behaved black classmates. Head teachers should be prepared to implement and communicate an inclusive school ethos. Lastly, a diverse teaching body is critical, one that supports inclusion by offering unique insights and serving as role models to all students. In India, the percentage of teachers from scheduled castes has increased, but castes are still underrepresented in the profession. What data are collected and how they are used determines whether inclusion is served. There is a potential tension. Identifying groups makes those disadvantaged visible, helping to prompt action. But doing so can also reduce children to labels, which can be self-fulfilling. Not all children facing inclusion barriers belong to an identifiable or recognized group. Other children belong to several groups at the same time. Portugal has introduced a non-categorical approach to determine special needs. Censuses and surveys help monitor outcomes at population level. The situation has improved in recent years, although gaps remain. Since 2015, 41% of countries representing 13% of the global population have not had a publicly available household survey to provide disaggregated data on key education indicators. But censuses and surveys also face challenges in formulating questions identifying nationality, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity, which can touch on sensitive personal information, be intrusive, and trigger persecution fears. Kenya has added new ethnic group categories as well as intersex as a gender option in its latest 2019 census. Much progress has been made. Statistical measurement of disability is beginning to catch up with the social model. Data from 14 low and middle income countries in 2017-2019 using the new child functioning module showed that 12% of children had a disability. But large discrepancies remain. Some countries do not capture even basic data. For instance, Cameroon and Nigeria had no enrollment data on children with visual impairments. Others monitor even substantive student experiences. New Zealand monitors whether students feel cared for, safe, and secure, along with their ability to establish and maintain positive relationships, respect others' needs, and show empathy.
Thanks, Manos. Well, we've heard that we need serious efforts to prepare, empower, and motivate the education workforce and ensure that all teachers should be prepared to teach all students. Even if a country's policies aren't inclusive, a teacher can teach in an inclusive way. Similarly, if a country might have inclusive policies, but a teacher's bias might mean that discrimination in the classroom can still exist. This means teachers are crucial partners in delivering an inclusive education. Teachers need to be equipped with the skills and attributes to be able to meet the needs of their students. In the case of Kenyan teacher Anthony Weir, his experience as a deaf student left him determined to support others in inclusive and special education. Let's hear from Anthony now, who joins us from Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. Anthony uses Kenyan Sign Language, and his signing will be interpreted into American Sign Language for those joining our event today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Were. I am working with Humanity and Inclusion as a project officer in inclusive education, and I am a teacher. We support children with disabilities in Kakuma to access education in different ways. First, we identify and refer children to school. We also create awareness in the school to reduce stigma and discrimination at the school. We train teachers also on inclusive education. We also have classroom assistants who support children and teachers in large classrooms. For me, as a person who is deaf, it was hard for me to communicate with teachers and learners who did not know sign language. Over time, they have learned a little sign language. Children are exciting to interact with because with an interpreter, they like, and I hope they will be able to learn very fast. My education was a bit different because I went through a special school where I have my peers who are deaf, but inclusive education encourages interaction and acceptance. After the outbreak of coronavirus, schools were closed. Learners and teachers stayed at home. This has slowed down the steps of inclusive education. Children miss school, but we have changed our school activities to the community, and at the community we have classroom assistants supporting children in their homes, and they are accessing learning at home. We have community dialogues with community leaders who help to make the community safe for children with disabilities. Thank you.
No country in the world has fully inclusive education, which is why the GEM report has launched a poll for people to participate in, no matter where you are in the world, a link to which has just gone up in the chat. It asks you to say which of the GEM report recommendations should be prioritized first in your country, and to send those poll results to your education minister. There is no one answer to the question in the poll because inclusive education is not an end goal, but a process. And plenty of countries have made extremely positive moves in the right direction. And we must learn from the experience of others, share knowledge and resources, and support one another on this journey.
Alongside the report, as we just heard, the report is excited to also launch a new website today. Its name is PEER, which stands for Profiles Enhancing Education Reviews. Over the years, the report has focused on monitoring global quantitative indicators, but its twin mandates called for it to also monitor the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4. The PEER website aims to address this need. I'm sure all of you with an interest in comparative education have asked yourselves at some point the question, how does country X or Y approach one or the other education policy issue? In this first edition, PEER includes profiles describing how every country approaches inclusion in education through its laws and policies. It is a companion to the 2020 GEM report. We use these profiles to map trends on selected issues by region. I refer to some of those statistics in this presentation. We believe that much can be learned from countries sharing experiences and hope that our site, PEER, will enable this process at the regional or sub-regional level. Profiles on different key issues to SDG 4 will be added to those now on the site. We're already working on profiles for our next report in 2021, with a focus on how countries regulate non-state actors in education. Profiles on equitable finance will be published soon as well. PEER forms a group with our two other websites. WIDE, on education inequalities, is a database celebrating its 10th anniversary this year and is on an exciting new development path in our partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. Scope, which was launched in January, is an interactive companion to the monitoring part of the report, which allows you to compare trends over time and patterns across countries on SDG 4 indicators, offering insightful narratives. We invite you to take a look. In a world increasingly faced with uncertainty and precariousness, inclusion has to be central to the future of education. I would like to thank each and every one of you here for your help in disseminating these messages and in advocating about their importance. What you have seen is the peak of hard work over the past year and a half. I would like to therefore thank my team for its inspiring commitment and all our partners for standing by us all this time. In the last quarter of this year, we will be launching 2 regional editions on inclusion and education. The first on Latin America and the Caribbean, and the second on Central and Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Stay tuned, and thank you very much for following.
What is evident is that the challenge of achieving inclusion in education cannot be met by one country alone. The report calls for unified solutions to help policymakers prioritise change that really matters. Let's hear again from Helen on what it will take to pave a way forward and ensure an inclusive and equal education for all learners by 2030.
The 2020 Education Monitoring Report is a call to action. It's a call to widen our understanding of inclusive education so that it includes all learners, no matter their identity, their background, or their abilities. It's a call to collect better data, without which we can't understand the true scope of the challenges of exclusion we face. It's a call to make public policies far more inclusive, drawing on best practice of effective policies which are currently in place. It's a call to share those best practices and expertise on how we can make our societies fairer and more humane. So we stand at a crossroads. Countries can draw from their experiences and innovations in education during the pandemic. They can design and build education systems which foster fairer societies and which find new ways of adapting to the needs of all children everywhere. This new GEM report helps us all understand the path we must take in the future, and its messages couldn't come at a better time.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks to all our speakers who we've heard from over the past hour. You are all true champions of inclusion, working to change mindsets at the school, community, and national level. Today's launch is just the beginning of a movement that needs to be taken forward by all of us watching here today. We each have a role to play in ensuring that no child is left behind. During today's event, we've received dozens of comments, including from Julia, working with humanity and inclusion to strengthen education across Africa, and Lorraine, working with children in Sydney, Australia, working with young children with disabilities to enter schools along with their peers. Thank you both for your comments and for your work. And we now invite you to continue the discussion. Participants joining on the platform can engage in a live Q&A discussion with today's speakers. The speakers will be available to answer questions for an hour following this event, so that's from now until around 12 o'clock Central European Summertime time. To participate in the Q&A, please click Speaker Q&A in the navigation menu at the top of your screen. For those of you who are watching on other platforms, please keep posting your comments and your questions using the hashtag #AllMeansAll, hashtag #AllMeansAll. And don't forget to have your say on which of the recommendations should be prioritized first in your country via the GEM report poll. We're going to leave you with a final call to action from the GEM report, one that underlines that each of us has a role to play in ensuring inclusion and education. Thank you again and goodbye.
We live in a world where no two people are the same. Each of us with our own unique abilities and challenges, preferences and dreams. A diversity that should be reflected across our school systems. But for many, it is not.
मी विचार केला की जर मोठ्या घरचे लोक शिकू शकतात तर आपण का नाही शिकू शकत. माझी तर इच्छा होती. त्याच्यानंतर हा पण विचार आला की माझ्या आई-वडिलांनी वर्षानुवर्ष रस्त्यावरती राहून काढले. मग त्यांना पण माझी इच्छा होती की त्यांना पण असं म्हणजे सगळे घरामध्ये राहतात. मला पण इच्छा आहे की मी पण एक स्वतःचा रूम घेईल शिकून मोठी झाल्यावरती.
By 2030, we aim to achieve inclusive education for all, no matter the region, income, or challenge ahead. This is the decade of action, and together we must ensure that all really does mean all in every classroom. To achieve true inclusion, we will need to place students' differences at the core of our education systems, understanding them as strengths to be celebrated, not as problems to be solved. From children to policymakers, parents to principals, everyone will need to get involved. Countries will need to understand the challenges and underlying disadvantages facing their students and directly address each individual's multi-layered needs. Inclusion cannot be achieved one group at a time. It requires more and better data on those being excluded from education to make the invisible visible again.
Accurate data is important for everything as a great starting point.
To make data come alive for action, you need these very lively and sustained partnerships.
But simply moving students from special schools into mainstream schools that lack the appropriate resources will not work. It requires a complete shift in systems and teachers that are well trained with the right learning materials and assessments to meet the needs of their students.
Guter Unterricht ist für uns kooperativer Unterricht, in dem Schüler auch gemeinsam Probleme lösen, nicht immer nur der Lehrer gefragt ist. Das heißt, ich verlasse meinen Status der allwissenden Lehrperson.
We need to break down preconceptions about particular groups to ensure that all children feel welcome in school and have the chance to thrive.
We believe that everybody at the lab is an agent of transformation. Some of them report that the lab gave them a voice. We help them in this way as to become protagonists, to awaken their potential.
Across the world, governments and policymakers will need to ensure equitable financing. Allocating these resources to children that are the furthest behind will need to be planned jointly.
Partnership cannot be overemphasized. So you may not be a health person, but you may be an administrator, you may be an innovator. We can put all of these to the table and then make it work.
The path ahead will have its challenges, but working together, learning from our peers, we can ensure that all means all, and every child has the chance to reach their full potential.